Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the show. Today, I have with me Tom Goodwin. Tom is the author of the book Digital Darwinism, Survival of the Fittest in the Age of Business Disruption. And soon, as I understand it, the second edition, slightly changed title of Digital Darwinism, Surviving the New Age of Business Disruption. I met Tom on Twitter. I sort of started following Tom. We follow each other. But what I absolutely loved about Tom was his ability to ask questions, challenge everything, be super productive about it as well. It's more on the lines of, I want to improve the way things work rather than it's all a bit rubbish, isn't it? And just moan about it. Very inquisitive. Tom, I'm really pleased to have you on the show and great to talk to you. So thanks for coming along.
My pleasure. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
You know, the other brilliant thing I learned coming into this was your claim, the quote of Uber, the world's largest taxi company, owns no vehicles. Facebook, the world's most popular media owner, creates no content, which is still being used by lots of people today to explain digital disruption and transformation. Sorry.
People use it to try and sell any new concept. It's amazing. Yeah. Sometimes I see it with, used to promote Bitcoin or NFTs or all manner of different things.
So when did you say that one?
I think 2015 or something.
Ah,
and there
so
was
long.
A weird period where everyone kept on using it in presentations on me without realizing that I'd written it.
Well, I didn't know until this week that was from you. So I've probably been one of those dreadful people that have used it without quoting the original, but now I will. So I'm pleased about that. So do you want to introduce yourself a bit more? So who you are, a bit about your background, and what you're up to.
I trained in architecture, which I loved, but didn't want to be an architect. Fell in love with the idea of working in advertising. Had a sort of 20-ish year career in advertising where I got really thoughtful about technology. Years ago, I worked on the Nokia account. And it was all about, what does technology mean? How would smartphones change our life? And I became a lover of both technology, but also people. So how does technology change our lives? How does it change the way that we date? How does it change the way we buy things? And I tried to sort of bridge the world of people and technology. Then I started having opinions on stuff and writing things down. And then people liked what I said because it was different. Then I was asked to write a book. Then I presented a TV show. And now I help companies understand what matters in a changing world. Because everyone's always going on about things being faster than ever and more complicated than ever. And, 5G is going to change everything. And I try to have a little bit more of a stupid and philosophical and sort of practical approach towards it, which is just to be a bit more real.
Yeah, well, that's what I said at the start. That's what I really like about it is sort of you just ask questions, but it's, as I say, it's not in a, isn't this all shit? Let's all like moan about it. It's in a, let's really understand it. Let's really question it so that we can make it better. We can move it forward. It's sort of not the extreme views and uneducated views you often get on things like Twitter, but it's much more of a, profound, let's really understand this. And I love also the sort of how you think about, and you just explain that, applying it to how it impacts people, because that's ultimately, we're all here and we all interface with technology and digital, and that's the important bit.
And especially normal people. I mean, we're obsessed with how people in Hoxton behave, or what Williamsburg people who are 27 and run digital agencies do. But what does this mean for people in rural America? What does this mean for people in sub-Saharan Africa? What does this mean for different class demographics and stuff? So,
yeah. I mean, you talk a lot about disruption. It's in the title of your book. But I suppose it's sort of where we maybe start is sort of what's the context of disruption and the way you think about disruption. As you say, lots of people talk about everything's changing fast, everything speeds up, it's all being disrupted. But what do we mean by that, and why does it matter?
It's a very good question. I mean, disruption has become one of those words which is kind of filler on a press release. You could launch a shampoo today that you sold in Boots and say it's sort of disruptive. What I think of it is this. I mean, every time a new technology comes along, there's a sort of period of time where it gets deployed and where people start to use it. And then there's a period of time where people understand the meaning and the implications of it. And technology has radical effects on business models. It has radical effects on how we behave. It has radical effects on how much things cost to produce.
Yeah.
And what I think of disruption is more an approach where you challenge the assumptions that have held people back. And people will always then think of, oh, it's Uber, because we didn't want to get in a stranger's car, or it's Airbnb because we didn't want to stay in a stranger's house. But it could also be innocent smoothies. That was nothing to do with technology. That was just challenging assumption that people didn't want to eat, a smoothie. It could be Starbucks challenging the assumption that, coffee shops couldn't be expensive. It could be Dyson. It could be Tesla. I try to think more empathetically, like we've got this amazing sort of toolkit of new technology, and that allows us to approach categories and industries and segments with a different sense of the constraints in that industry. Right. And that allows us to do really amazing things that can probably make us a lot of money. I try and help people unlock that.
Is it always digital? You mentioned innocent there, which sort of isn't, but it might have been something driving it. But is most of the disruption about digital, or is it about something, bigger, geopolitical or societal sort of change?
I don't think it has to be digital, but I think it's quite likely in the period of time now that these areas for exploitation are related to digital. Yeah. In a way, online dating, that's not a particularly technology heavy solution. And it's much more about people, and it's much more about how people live. So there are areas like that, which, sometimes it's about design, sometimes it's about behaviors, but it's normally in the sort of stream, it's in the environment of technology more broadly.
I think that's been the thing that's sped it up. If we talk about pace,
yes,
you're allowed and able to move quicker in technology and digital.
Yes, and without being sort of too boring, I talk a bit in the book about the design process and how the design process is based on constraints. Because we can't sort of design something without any constraints, because our mind would sort of explode. So we fix constraints, and we fix the idea that gravity exists. We fix the idea that we should probably make profit. We fix the idea that steel is what steel is. But often many of these assumptions have been fixed, even though technology changes them. And that's where things get really exciting to me. What could a bank do in the digital age? What could a transportation company become? What happens if you can open a retailer, in 170 countries, in 2 seconds with a Shopify account, etc.
Is it? I often think about this. Who does innovation? Who drives innovation? Is it technology providers innovating because they want to or need to, or is it customers forcing the innovation because they need to get better? Is it governments and regulation that drives the change? Like, where does it come from? Not. I don't mean who actually ends up doing the innovation, like an engineer, comes up with a new idea, but what's the driver for it? It's probably a better way of asking that.
These things vary, and it depends on the country and culture. I think by and large, it's actually driven more by people. It's a lot easier to innovate around a behavior that you can see happening, and then to effectively create a sort of solution to that behavior. The other way to do it is to use technology to make something possible that people didn't think was possible, and then to imagine it being so profoundly wonderful that everyone will adopt it and love it. And that's possible, but it's really hard. I mean, the iPhone is a sort of classic example of that, really, where people were not going around taking photographs of things and uploading them to Instagram or equivalents before. But when you knew you could, you started behaving that way.
It creates innovation spawns innovation, doesn't it? You always get spin-offs that can happen because they couldn't have happened before, they can now because something new exists.
And it's the sort of second order effects as well, which are really hard to understand. But I mean, this isn't really the question, but what bothers me is so many companies seem to think that technology is the factor for innovation, and therefore a business should be formed by what happens when 5G meets the Internet of Things, or what happens when GPS chips interface with cameras. And it's actually much better to think we're human beings. We're trying to find shelter. We're trying to broadcast our status to other people. We're trying to procreate. We're trying to be safe. how can we solve those problems in a world where technology exists?
It's interesting that's I think that is back to the question of what's the driver? Because on one hand, it's like it's got to solve some problems that we all have, otherwise we might not want it. And on the other hand, you've got something like the iPhone where it's like, well, here's something you didn't know you needed, and we all frigging loved it and can't get enough of it. And it's whether that cycle keeps happening. You need the kind of innovators that are going, there's something we got to create here that we didn't even know you needed. And then there's something which is we got to satisfy either a problem or a demand. You think about, I suppose, Elon Musk is talking about solving problems that we have. He's going on that route, but there's other people that are solving problems that we didn't yet know we had.
Yes, no, exactly. And in a way, it's a sort of false choice. Like these things are a little bit more circular.
Yeah.
Where, kind of technology kind of creates behaviors, and then things that we didn't know were possible kind of reinforces them.
Yeah.
But it's certainly a useful construct to think about them. Yeah.
Yeah. Nice. You've changed in the second edition of your book. You've changed from, let me get this right, survival of the fittest in the age of business disruption to surviving the new age of business disruption. What is that change, and does that sort of reflect like that the world has changed since you wrote the first edition, or just sort of your thinking has moved on?
I'm trying to remember.
Cool. Yeah, you've changed the title of your book, right?
Well, joking aside, I haven't really talked about my new book yet, actually. Okay. What happened was the publisher was really keen for me to do another book, and I said no because it's really hard to write a book.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it's like being pregnant in your brain. Like it's a horrible feeling.
Yeah.
And then they got a bit annoyed and said, well, why don't you do another version of your book? Just update it a little bit. There's this pandemic thing going on. Maybe you should make it a bit more relevant for that. And I didn't really want to do that, but I thought it wouldn't be that hard. So I agreed to do a sort of updated version of the book. So I kind of started on page 1. And then I basically rewrote the whole bloody book from scratch. Which was a really stupid thing to do, because it means that everyone thinks it's not that different. And it means that I don't, probably I can't say I've written 2 books, but I definitely have. I mean, it's a completely different book.
Right.
I was very vulnerable when I wrote the first book, in that when you're commanding that people spend, hours of their time reading something. And when you are, sufficiently young to realize that you're young, you think, who am I to have these opinions? Who am I to say that McKinney are idiots? Yeah. And then this time I thought, actually, people have responded quite nicely to this book. Maybe I'm not an idiot. So it's a much more confident and pragmatic guide. So it's trying to explain the new era that we're in, which is a slightly sort of post-pandemic-y world. It's starting to be more confident about giving advice to companies on what they can do about how different life is.
Gotcha. It's you've answered the question of whether I should do a second edition of my book or not, by the way, because I know how hard the first book is. But I wonder if it's a bit like actually the sort of difficult second album of a sort of pop artist or something.
I think so. I think I'm not someone to give advice on these stuff, because I'm just one person. But I think people know if they have it in them.
Yeah.
People, way too many authors write books because they were asked to. I think one needs to do this because you feel like you have enough to say that the world needs to listen to.
Yeah.
And that's quite a difficult question to answer. But yeah, do a new book, not a new edition. So
that's good. That's good. That's a good tip. But even if you set out to write a second edition, it turns out to be a new book anyway. Is the other thing you just taught me. No, you mentioned pandemic there. I wanted to kind of go to that. I don't really want to kind of go over the pandemic, but because that's well trodden, and God, we're over it, aren't we, by now? But something is happening again, I think, at the moment, which is we are coming out of the restrictions that the pandemic puts on us and the changes that happened very quickly. And, everyone was talking about the new normal, and, everyone moved online and events all went online. We had all this stuff that moved online. Companies that were in that space exploded, did brilliantly, outperformed all previous years. Isn't this going to last forever? We're in a new normal. But we seem to be in a kind of like, hang on a minute. No, we're sort of reverting back in some instances, not everything, of course, but we seem to be reverting back to some of the kind of norms that we had, going back to real life events rather than online events. Netflix has died off a little bit and everyone's sort of running around crazy because of that. What do you see? Are we in, back to the old normal? Are we in a new normal, or in this just different place?
The short sort of tweetable answer to the question is I don't think that much is actually going to be very different. And that's extremely disappointing, I know, to hear, and not going to get me any speaking gigs whatsoever. There was this amazing hack which I came up with where I got to see the future. And I did it by getting in a car and driving for about 19 hours. So in April 2020, I got in a car and I drove to Georgia, which, as it happened, I didn't know it was going to be at the time. As it happened, it was the first state to open up after the pandemic restrictions.
And just for context, where from?
From New York, sorry. From some New York, which was sort of, I don't know if you can say this, but ground zero almost for the pandemic, right, where everyone's lives were radically altered and there was significant trauma in all directions and there was the army on the streets. And then you arrived in rural Georgia and no one gave a shit. And literally nothing had really changed. No one really cared about it. It was a very rural area. And I lived in sort of rural America, driving around, talking to people for about 6 months. And at that time, restaurants opened up. It was quite strange, actually. You'd see all these articles on Wired about how, in-person dining was never going to be the same again because we'd all have sort of lampshades on our heads. You'd read all these reports about how retailers would have to change for the future because if we touched a book, it would need to be quarantined again. Yeah. And there I was in Charleston or Savannah or in some shitty town in the middle of the Appalachians, and everything was already precisely back to normal. Then I came to Florida, where the pandemic never really happened. So I'm not being too facetious about it, but I think people in the bubble-like atmosphere of big cities actually missed out on the notion that what behaviors we exhibit are very human behaviors, and human nature doesn't tend to change that much. And it's going to be different in places because there are sort of new behaviors that people have learned in some ways, like remote work. But I think broadly speaking, life works in paradigms. And the paradigm where we're all at home all day is a paradigm which makes sense because we can get food delivered to us. We can stay inside. We can make every single video call on time. The moment we are asked to leave the house, all of a sudden a video call doesn't make sense. The moment we leave the house, all of a sudden we may as well pick up shopping on the way out. All of a sudden, the moment we're dropping a daughter off at gymnastics and the Amazon guy can't leave the package, we realize it would have been bad to go to Target or Sainsbury's instead. So life tends to work in paradigms. And I see no evidence whatsoever that any part of our future paradigm will be radically different, apart from some sectors where people will be working from home more. But then the long-term effects of that will be that people will lose their jobs to people in cheaper countries. So I imagine maybe even that won't be that significant.
Yeah. I mean, is there a potential for a bigger change in that though? So I think about the companies, particularly the sort of Facebooks, Amazons of this world, and Teslas and Elon's world, who just accelerated hugely over the last 2 years and got even more cash and even more ability to invest and kill off competition and all the things that are thrown at them. Doesn't that create, because of the power that they already have, the potential for them to do even more, either harm or good, depending on how they focus that cash and their energies?
I'm not sure. I mean, they're clearly dominant in their categories, but their categories are not that dominant. So it may be the case that Amazon, I'm not up to date with my numbers here, but they may have 65 or 70% of all US e-commerce. But if you add up all the sort of value of US commerce, it's still probably about sort of 15 or 20%. Right. The reality is lots of people, want to touch an iPhone case before they buy it. Lots of people want to talk to somebody to get advice on a TV. The unit economics of a lot of their products don't make that much sense in e-commerce age.
Yeah. But that just means that other people can't afford to do what they do, though, that unit economics problem, and they can.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the case that I can see Amazon increasing market share, but not incredibly quickly. And these things are rarely winner takes all markets. often in life there are sort of reactions to every reaction without going all Newtonian on you. And the more you use Amazon, the more you realize it's quite nice to, experience a different browsing experience somewhere else. The more you use Netflix, the more live TV seems quite appealing. The more Spotify you listen to, the more it's quite nice to listen to the radio. So I'm not being so dismissive as to say that nothing's going to change at all. But I think for most people thinking about most aspects of their lives, not that much is that different over the long term.
Do you think our relationship with or interaction with technology has changed or will continue to change? Maybe not solely because of the pandemic, but sort of more broadly.
I don't know. I don't know, if I'm honest. It's very useful to have kids at moments like this, and I don't. I think we're very, very, very quick to love statements about how everything's going to change everything. If I think about my sort of background, I grew up in a little village in the middle of Oxfordshire, and I'd watch TV. I'd still go out and play sports. And I think over the last 20 years, we've seen kids stay inside more and spend more time on the internet. And I think we can see how that could lead to things like the metaverse and people having more social time in a virtual world. But you can also see how that leads to, families saying, enough is enough. You're not coming to dinner. Just put down the bloody phone. We could also see a sort of reaction against that, where people start to appreciate more about the real life. And like you said before, we sort of hop in, the death of these platforms is kind of down to the sort of overcorrection in a way. Like the reason why people went to events is to escape the office more than it was to be sort of entertained or to learn. People had to network really, and online platforms don't replace those elements really. So
I like that phrase of overcorrected. I think that's the Netflix scenario as well. It's like, well, this scale of growth is going to continue forever, isn't it? Well, no, because people aren't at home anymore, and the cost of living has gone up, and that's a luxury. And we've got TV that's free here, so let's watch. You know what I mean? So the overcorrection on. Did we estimate the change that was happening and how long that would last? And obviously most people didn't know. So it's easy to make big statements about how this is going to stick.
Yeah. And even the overcorrection probably won't last that long. I mean, I met lots of people in the pandemic, and I'd asked them if they were going to go on a cruise again. And they said, I'm going to go on cruises more than ever before.
Yeah.
And one would imagine they'll go on a few cruises and then they'll return to their normal pattern of, cruise every
holiday once a year. Yeah.
People haven't seen Granny for a while, so they can't wait to see her. Then they see her and realize, it's not that much fun, and they don't need to do that often. And they do it as they used to before. Yeah. So in a weird way, we may look back at the sort of pandemic as being this slightly strange time, and we can't really remember what happened.
Yeah, it could be. I have got two kids, and they are like stereotypical kids growing up in this era with phones and Netflix and tablets and that sort of thing. And there's as many positives as negatives. The negatives keep me awake at night and just cause me endless anxiety about, is this good? Is this bad? Is it too much? Is it not enough? I make these arbitrary rules about how long, how not long, when they should stop, when they should start. And it's like my angst in life is their interaction and relationship with technology. And I try not to be the kind of, in my day, we didn't have the iPads. It must be bad because it's changed, but equally, you need to be aware of the impact these things are going to have. But the really interesting bit is, they finished their primary school before moving to secondary school. And, in my day, you'd sort of leave primary school. You wouldn't see any of those kids anymore unless they came to your secondary school with you. He's still friends with all of them because he's on WhatsApp with them. He games with them. He talks to them on FaceTime. Do you know what I mean? He's got a tool to continue relationships with people, which is amazing. It's like completely amazing. So you kind of find this balance between allowing, enabling, and sort of, helping to teach good digital habits, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, one hopes that he still meets lots of new people in his new school and he has the best of both. I think the best framework to think about this stuff. And I think it's absolutely terrifying. I have no idea how people bring up kids in this age.
It's whack-a-mole. I was explaining to a friend the other day, it's literally whack-a-mole of problem of learning and then solving that one and moving on to the next.
Yeah, but I think the best framework, this is a very sort of facile answer, is to think of all the things that this is adding and then try to get as many of the good things from it as possible, and then think of all of the really damaging potential problems and to try and minimize the risk of that.
Yeah,
nothing like that easy.
There's as many problems as being able to run around the streets as we used to than there is on being online, I'm sure. So, change in sort of subject, if I may. A lot of our listeners are sort of in sort of data as their kind of industry, chief data officers, people who are responsible for setting the data strategy and executing the data strategy for a business, where the objective is to harness the data that they've got and use it for business or shareholder or stakeholder value in some way, shape, or form. How much experience, I mean, maybe in your marketing world, but how much in your experience of people doing this well, and how much of this is, a little bit of kind of over optimistic view about how really data is going to change the way people do things?
Most companies are now doing it very badly, actually. I mean, when we called it big data, we kind of celebrated the size of it. And then we seemed to sort of compete on how much data we could gather. And at no point did anyone really think, one, why do we need this? Two, how are we measuring this? Three, where does it go? Like, who has access to it? Four, what's the sort of governance and the procedure behind taking care of this? And it sounds a little bit unfair, but most clients I worked with had way too much data, like way too much. And it was mostly pretty dirty and it was mostly pretty unhelpful. And they didn't really want to accept that. And data became a sort of religion almost, where everyone wanted to talk about it and boast about it. And I think in a weird way, it's probably damaging for the kind of data industry to be in this situation we are in now, where we kind of believe in the power of it, but we're not really seeing that much in the way of people sort of using it in ways which are profoundly different or valuable. And I think we need a bit of a rethink about it, really. I think we need to be a lot more thoughtful about its role. It's obviously very different in different parts of the marketing cycle. But there seems to be a lacking in empathy. I think I'm not being critical to your listeners, but the more you understand about technology and data, generally speaking, the more you're not inquisitive about human behavior. And you tend to think that people act logically. You tend to assume that we know more about people than we really know. We tend to assume that people are more predictable than they really are. We tend to make assumptions which are helpful to our career. Like, we assume that customers will become loyal. And I think the real skill for the future is not to have a sort of data-oriented culture when in the past we had a sort of empathy culture. It's actually to sort of find a way to sort of merge those two brilliant ways of thinking together.
Yeah, I think that's certainly the more successful organizations that we see are the ones that can use data and insights to guide the decisions that they have to make. And those decisions they have to make are just the business decisions that they have to make. And if they are shaped by a good strategy and a good customer focus and a good intent, then the data should just follow. That's kind of that's how we see things. So, and are you sort of, we've talked about digital, we talked about disruption, we've talked about data. We haven't yet mentioned AI, artificial intelligence at all. But of course, a lot of the technology that is powering some of the transformational change that we see in industries and some of the companies that we've already talked about is powered by the insight that they have, the data they have about individuals or about things that they do or about places or whatever it may be. AI, is that again, what's your view? Is it kind of overhyped? Is it kind of actually something that's really important and we need to be careful? We've got to have the right guardrail. Where's your view on how it's sort of developed and where it's going, if you have a view?
These things are sort of amazing tools. I really mean that. Like, it's very easy for me to sound more miserable than I really am, but they're incredibly profound tools, but they need to be used in the right place. And when we embraced an era like big data, these things were sort of vague, amorphous sort of philosophies that then we sort of embraced, but it led to lots of disappointment. It led to lots of sort of misuse of it, I think. And I think we have to be a little bit careful with AI that we don't become too impractical about what it can do and what it means. I think, I see all these adverts, AI will help people do this, AI will, uncover insights. I don't think that's particularly true unless you've structured your business in the right way. I think companies that embrace AI at the very core of their processes, that create data structure around an expectation of AI being powerful, and then they use it in the right ways, I think those companies can transform. In particular, I see it as a way to sort of automate the mundane things that really don't matter and are easy, and that then allows people to spend more of their time being more human and adding more value to that data.
Yeah.
The best sort of metaphor, which is also a real example, is using AI to create sports highlight reels. Like, you would be an absolute idiot if you think you can ingest sort of 200 games of soccer, football, and use AI to make a highlight reel of those games, because highlight reels involve a narrative and a story arc, and it involves music, and it involves picking the moments which are a little bit strange. You would be far better off having an AI to pick out 300 minutes of 30,000 minutes, and those clips would be based on the audience volume, and it would be based on moments which you knew were special because the goal was scored. And then a human would overlook those and then use their own sort of judgment to figure out the order. And I think that becomes the right kind of framework to think about this stuff. It's not replacing people.
It's a good relationship to have, isn't it, with the technology, supporting the human intuition and, as you say, empathy before.
Yeah.
There was I might get this fact slightly wrong, but one of the Wimbledons a couple of years back, I think IBM stated that it was the first competition where all the highlights were generated by I assume Watson, actually, but their AI algorithm, whether it was what you just said, which is that it served up a bunch of highlights for some humans to choose, or whether it genuinely kind of created the 2-minute highlight reel. I don't know. But
it would be really interesting to see. But also, I think IBM this year, I can't remember which tennis I was watching, but they predicted some winner, and the winner clearly had no chance. Like, anyone with any sort of instinct for the game would know, he's got a dodgy shoulder at the moment, and like the left ankle looks a bit wobbly today. And everyone, when they saw this prediction, just laughed at it, and then it was completely wrong. So all of these, everything in the world tends to come down to a really simple debate these days, where it's like, AI is good, AI is bad, 5G is amazing.
It's all nuanced.
It's like, where do you use it? How do you use it? Like, what's the process for using it? And in particular, my very strongly held belief is this technology needs to be applied very deeply. So you can't just have an AI department and sort of stream a little bit of data from a few servers into it and hope it makes a difference. You have to think, how should this airline be constructed in an era where AI exists? How does this empower people to make better decisions? So.
Leads me nicely into where probably the last sort of area I wanted to explore with you, which is I've seen you sort of publicly say this, and I think it's in the book, which is what would your business look like if you built it today, which is a little bit sort of where you just got to there about building a company around maybe some AI products. Why is that question important to you? Why does it? And if it is, why does it sort of engender some different thoughts and opinions from people?
I don't like saying this, and I really hope I'm wrong. But when you ask people for examples of companies that have really profoundly changed in the digital age, there are very few no examples. One of them that it's a little bit less fashionable to talk about this second is Netflix. But arguably that was quite a small company when it changed. Another one is Microsoft. But broadly speaking, big companies have not changed. And that's okay, because we don't tend to change as people. When we reach a certain age in life, we're not that able to really significantly change. And we certainly only change if we go through a really significant sort of philosophical and profound process. And digital transformation is sort of based on this idea that someone comes in for the day and asks a few good questions, and then they put a group of people on it, and then they build a new sort of process, or they add a technology somewhere, or they outsource something, and then the company's different. And it really has not worked out like that so far. And we're at a curious time where big companies are kind of fine. Like this idea that you have to disrupt or die, I think is nonsense. But big companies could do better. And one way to do that is to try to change, which I think is often impossible. And the other way is to create. We've never lived at an easier time to create. I literally created a bookstore which sold my book online using drop shipping. I sold more than 10,000 copies. And it took me about 45 minutes and a glass of red wine to do that. I don't know anything about, coding. I don't know anything about website development, but I was able to do that in an hour.
Yeah.
And it makes you realize it's a lot easier for me to make a website that sells a book in 170 countries than it is for W.H. Smith to move their catalog online. And I think it's an empowering feeling to realize that you can sort of alter your future, but through creation rather than change.
Yeah. Is there but isn't that a conflict with what we talked about disruption? So if actually not much changes and people don't change a huge amount, why are we all running around going, disruption, we got to transform, when I think what you're saying is really where it's sort of new, starting from scratch is where you can really make a big difference, rather than huge transformation to become something very different, which I get why that's hard, and I've seen why that's hard. So is there on these essentially opposing
they sort of are, and that's why these things are difficult, because it depends on your category. Like, sometimes I go around saying, all these companies need to change, and sometimes I go around saying all these companies don't need to change. And that's just because companies are in different situations.
Yeah.
If you're a department store, you genuinely are screwed. There's no reason for a department store to exist.
Yeah.
If you're a big bank, you're not screwed, but we should be aware of the fact that your company could be built on very different foundations.
Yeah.
If you're in the business of steel production, like, you probably don't need to change anything at all. So trying to sort of explore these nuances is quite hard.
Yeah.
That's why it takes a book. But the general feeling, I think, is just that we should ask these questions. We should ask, do we need to change? We should ask, what could our future be? We should ask, can we change? And based on those questions, which are in my book, actually, you should be able to figure out the type of plan that you could implement. And sometimes that may involve, mergers. Sometimes that may involve acqui-hires. Maybe that involves creating startups. And it will all depend on your situations, I guess. But yeah, there definitely is a lot of contradiction that sort of can come across.
No, that wasn't the challenge on you. Actually, it was more the general, because I think there is contradiction. As you say, we try and boil all these things down to be so simple. It's either yes or no, or forward or back, or innovate or don't, or thrive or die. You know what I mean? It's these kind of like phrases create some inertia into thinking that there's something happening, either that is happening, or it's misdirected, right?
Yeah.
And, I think the context and your appetite makes a big difference to whether you need to get ahead of this or not.
Yeah, and I like saying this is a little bit sort of punchy, but part of the problem for me at the moment is everyone makes more money by getting clients scared. So this narrative of disrupt or die, this sense that if you don't have big data, you're screwed. If you're not thinking about 5G or the blockchain or the metaverse, you're missing a trick. Yeah. And there are specific sectors where those things are quite significant. But generally speaking, we had distributed databases in the 1970s. We had technology that came to us in the 1980s and 90s, which we've still not used. And I think most companies would be better served by looking at their customers more and being aware of new and old technology, and just having a slightly more pragmatic approach to more deep innovation. Rather than doing these really sort of shiny things on the edges.
Yeah, makes sense. Cool. Well, look, to wrap up, I want to bring back to a phrase which you said to me sort of off air when I asked you sort of how you like to be introduced, and you talked about yourself as a nowist, which you didn't use at the start of this when you then introduced yourself. But so I want to understand that, just to kind of finish off. What do you mean? What the hell is a nowist?
The futurism is based on sort of outlandish things, often on unrealistic timescales, and it's based on, and I mean, almost entertainment. I mean, I'm not being too facetious, but there are times when you see futurists speak, and it's not really advice; it's just fun. So if you imagine yeah, and there may be a role for that in some companies, but I think it's much more interesting to look at technologies that exist now, business models that exist now, things that are possible in the near-term future, and technologies which are perhaps unloved. I've been talking about QR codes for years and how they would be amazing, and all that needs to happen is people need to create good uses for them. And then suddenly the pandemic happens and people embrace it. Yeah. So I think, it's things like, how do you create a really good buy online, pick up in store process? How do you figure out how often to send newsletters to people that doesn't piss them off? How do you truly measure customer satisfaction in a way that's more likely to be interesting than an NPS score? The questions of the moment and what we can do now, I think, are much more applicable and likely to cause growth.
Cool. Well, sounds like being an analyst is good fun. So, Tom, pleasure to meet you. Thank you very much for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. I'm glad I gave you the opportunity to talk about your book if you haven't done that much so far. Looking forward to dipping into the second edition because it's a different book, apparently. Yeah. So, no, really appreciate it. And thanks for spending time with us.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, Jason.
No worries. And thanks, everyone. Hope you enjoyed that episode and we'll catch you again soon.